Good morning and thank you for joining us. My name is Michael Fotheringham. I'm the Managing Director of AHURI, and I'm delighted to welcome you back to the AHURI Research Webinar Series. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that I'm hosting this webinar from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you're all working today and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this webinar. And I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters throughout Australia. Before we commence today's webinar, I want to let you know that AHURI is convening the National Homelessness Conference next month in Canberra, along with Homelessness Australia. The conference is being held Monday 8 to Wednesday 10 August 2022 at the National Convention Centre in Canberra, and there's still time to register to attend either in person or online. And the website details are on screen right now. So before I introduce today's speakers and the topic, I need to just provide you with a few instructions on the software and some basic housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded, so if you want to return to it later or forward it on to a colleague, the recording will be on the AHURI website in the coming days. You'll receive a survey, and we welcome your feedback so that we can refine and improve future webinars to ensure we're presenting information that's useful to you in a way that's useful to you. In terms of participating in today's webinar, some simple instructions follow. You'll have the opportunity to submit questions by typing in them in the Q&A section just to the right of the presentation screen. And you can submit your questions any time during the presentation. We'll collect these and address as many of them as we can during the Q&A segment following today's presentation. So let's focus on today's topic and presenters. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar, Individual Supported Living Arrangements for Adults with Intellectual Disabilities and High Support Needs. Our presenters today are Professor Angus Buchanan and Associate Professor Mary Ann Donovan, two of the authors of the AHURI report being covered in today's webinar. The research, Accommodating Adults with Intellectual Disabilities and High Support Needs in Individual Supported Living Arrangements, examines the current state of ISL in Australia, including the benefits, challenges and current policy opportunities. That report, along with a policy evidence summary and a standalone executive summary, are now available at the AHURI website, as well as in the handout section to the right of your screen. And I'll just mention that the slides are also available in that handout section. We do have a little bit of a formatting issue with the slides today that's made some of them a little less readable than usual. So they are available in their pure format in the handout section as well. Both of our researchers today are well experienced in this area of research, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from them. Angus Buchanan is the head of school at the Curtin School of Allied Health within the Faculty of Sciences at Curtin University. He's previously held several housing-related roles, including Director at the Disability Commission of Western Australia, where he led significant reforms in therapy and community coordination for people with disabilities. Mary Ann Donovan is Associate Professor of Disability Studies at the University of Sydney and the Executive Director of the Centre for Disability Studies. Mary Ann has a breadth of research experience involving management of national disability databases, analysis of large data sets, qualitative research, and policy content analysis. Many of you will notice there are four faces on the screen, so we also have with us Alicia Rathbone as the respondent following the research presentation. Alicia is the manager of the Summer Foundation Housing Hub, where she is responsible for the development of the enterprise's strategy, business plans and development of products and services across the accessible housing sector. So the format for today's webinar will include a co-presentation by Angus and Mary Ann, followed by a short sector response from Alicia. After that, I'll facilitate a discussion with our participants and take your questions from the audience. So again, please ask questions at any time throughout the presentations, and I'll do my best to include it in the discussion. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Angus Buchanan.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be with you all this morning. I also continue on the acknowledgement that I am on the lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people here in Perth, and Mary Ann is on the land of the Gadigal people in Sydney. And I also acknowledge and pay respect to elders past, present and emerging and all First Nations people. As I said, it's a pleasure to be here to present our work. I'd like to acknowledge that we are part of a much larger research team, and we're presenting this work on behalf of this really talented group of people. So great. So could you just move the next slide on for me? Thank you. So I maybe want to start, I teach students with occupational therapy students, one of the things I often talk to them about is, what do you want your life to look like? And often they speak about things such as, living in community, and they speak about living with friends and aspirations. And often then we enter into a strange conversation about what life for people with disabilities often is like, and the dissonance that sits in that space. And I think in many ways that sits at the heart of what this whole project is about. It's about people living good life in community. And the work that underpins this is about people having that opportunity. In Australia at the moment, based on AEST data 2019, there are 4.4 million Australians who identify with a disability. And in that group, there's obviously a much smaller group who identify with profound or severe disabilities, which it gets categorised around what are core activity limitations, but where people are requiring additional support to live, fulfilling lives, such as in mobility or self-care, schooling or employment. And we keep going down in that group, but there's nearly 200,000 Australians who, what they describe, live in cared accommodation, and that can range to formal supported accommodation. That was in 2018. 14,500 of those people are aged between 15 and 64. So there's a significant number of people who are living in this notion of called cared accommodation. And it is well understood, and the evidence is available, that people with high and very high support needs are at heightened risk of poor housing outcomes compared to people with disabilities generally, but actually we compare it to the whole population. People with disabilities have heightened housing outcomes. Historically, specialist disability housing, and it still is, the norm for people who have very high support needs, who are not living in arrangements such as their family home, where families or parents are supporting them, where formal paid supports are required to enable people to live effectively. I think consistent with national disability policy, NDIS, choice and control, living good lives, that sort of focus, people with disabilities quite naturally are increasing individualized living arrangements which cater for their specific needs and circumstances and strengths and vulnerabilities. And I was reading that again through this morning going, I live in a place which focuses on my individual needs and arrangements and my needs and strengths and vulnerabilities. It's actually living a normal life, and that's what people with disabilities are actually wanting. And that is very consistent with our national disability policy in supporting people. But people with intellectual disability, people with high support needs may experience, I think probably do experience multiple disadvantages in the housing market. Most people in this area are living on social security, and we know low incomes in the current housing market, it makes people very vulnerable. They're much more likely to rent social housing than people without disabilities. So we know we have this whole situation, this heightened vulnerability because people have disability in the circumstances, and that's heightened further when you have further support needs. So what is individual living support? And in some ways it's not that different what you could guess it is. This work, and I should have acknowledged also Professor Errol Cox, where this work comes from, who was involved initially in this project. And those papers will be referenced in the report, and if you're interested there, I encourage you to go back to them as the foundations of this work. This work is not about bricks and mortar per se. It's not about here is bricks and mortar and someone living. It's about work guided by 8 themes, which covers that this is an area which requires serious leadership from a policy level through to a service level, and how it actually responds to people. It's about actually people identifying as having a home, not somewhere to live. A very big difference. And I imagine most people here who are involved in housing and so on, the difference between a house and a home, quite foundational and fundamental. This is also about one person at a time. And you hear that a lot in disability work, but this is not about, I don't live in a street where 20 of us live in the same arrangements. We all have our individual arrangements. It's about me and my life. And this is about working with individuals about their individual life and how do you form what they want around that. So it's working with one person at a time, not 20 people at a time for a 20 people solution. It is about investment in planning, and we all know this sort of work takes time. It takes commitment. It takes often many people to be around and involved and in planning. It's often not quick work. It focuses on control, which is very much around the whole focus of our national disability policy, where people have control over their own lives in decision making. How are people involved and invested in what's happening in their life? ISL is about support. It's acknowledging, as we have flagged earlier, that people do have challenges. They have what call limitation activity challenges. It's a dreadful term, but it is what it is. And that appropriate supports are needed there to help people very much thrive, actually engage in life and actually be included. And that notion of social inclusion, participation, being part of your community, being actually that notion of full citizenship. So this is very much about the living arrangements and very much about what surrounds that to enable effectively what a lot of people talk about, a good life living in community. So there are four types of, there's four types there. Living alone, which speaks for itself, but with support, a host family arrangement, often known as alternative family arrangements or adult foster care. Co-residency, where a person lives, an emphasis in their own home, but actually other people come and live with them who may provide some support in exchange. For example, for free reduced rent or board. They might, for example, support that person 3 nights a week. So there are many successful arrangements like that. And the other one is just sharing with someone in an established relationship, friendship or intimate relationship. So there's nothing there which you look at going that remarkable. It's what actually sits around it and what actually achieves as an outcome is the remarkable bit. And the central part of this is about supports. It's about the availability of sustainable supports and appropriate supports and match supports at central around the individual for this to achieve. And they can be formal or informal, and that focus on individual growth. So they're the critical elements. So in the report, there's a lot more detail around that, but that's fundamentally what we're actually talking about this morning. So these arrangements are not new. They've been around for many years. And I suppose our project is about how do you start to harness that into a more systematic way of responding to people. They may lead to more appropriate and preferred homes for people with disability with high needs. This does sit in a national context of the NDIS and specialist disability housing accommodation. So I'm acknowledging this is not something that's sitting aside. This has to be sit as part of the policy framework we're currently sitting in Australia at the moment. That's a very much a Commonwealth-driven aspect, but also state governments have a major role as many people with disabilities are living in social housing stock, the affordability of that. And this is very much a project around there is an unmet need. We know that people are not necessarily getting the best outcomes, and that is what is actually driving the work that we're actually doing. So the next slide, please. So our research approach. So in this project, there were 4 distinct elements. The first one was a scoping review of literature. The second was that we did a secondary analysis of 19 interviews, which were carried out in a previous ARC-funded ISL study. This study conducted an additional 21 interviews, which were carried out as part of this study. And then also a community-based co-design approach was taken using a lot of the data to develop 4 thematic fact sheets. So I'm now going to hand over to Marianne, who's going to work through our results and findings, and I'll come back towards the end of this to talk about the policy implications and the where to from here.
Thanks so much, Angus. I'm going to start just by talking about the literature briefly, because the literature in itself was quite brief. It wasn't as extensive as we had anticipated, even though, as Angus says, these arrangements are not new. They have been around for some time now. We identified 435 papers, which we thought might give us some insight into ISL arrangements and the outcomes from that. But when we worked through all of those papers, there was only 10 that really met our criteria. And they were across Australia, Canada, the UK, and Ireland. And even within those 10, there were challenges because the definition of ISL was not always clear and not always consistent. So in some papers, you had a really broad explanation of supported living, independent supported living, and spoken about in opposition to institutional living, but not very specific details on the characteristics of the living arrangement and the supports. To the other end of the spectrum, where we had a very comprehensive definition, which included the physical setting and the supports. So it is a scoping review, and it has got limitations, but it did provide some insights into the outcomes that people have been experiencing, but also raised the gap in the literature and the gap in the evidence around this. So we know these arrangements are there, but we haven't got substantial evidence base on the outcomes, which is something that we come back to in the recommendations. So overall, we found that there was an improvement in at least one area of life post-transition in the literature. And this could be around choice, social inclusion, a sense of autonomy, independence. There was also other indicators, having greater access of our visitors to the home, access of community amenities, and there was some indication of a decrease in challenging behaviour for people who moved into individualised settings. Challenges and enablers were also identified in the literature. One of the key challenges is the lack of formal support, which then impacts on the informal support networks and an over-reliance on family in order to sustain these arrangements. Enablers in particular were having appropriate physical space, having private space within the home, and having the opportunity for autonomy in everyday participation, and essentially making own decisions about how one lives and where they're living as well. So many of these findings are drawn out in the analysis that we did. So we had, as Angus said, interviews from a previous ARC study where we looked at a subsample of people with high support needs and intellectual disability. And then we interviewed family members, support workers, and persons with intellectual disability about their current experience. So what we found is that there is a range of circumstances and outcomes. So very much in line with what Angus says, there's 4 different models, core models, and the range is lived out there in experience. And the majority of people are living alone or with a co-resident. They were the 2 dominant models out of the 4. And interestingly, mostly men were availing of ISL arrangements, and majority were younger as well. Although there was a very wide range in terms of the length of the arrangement. So even though most people were in their 20s and 30s, some arrangements had lasted 20 years. And we'll come to some of that in a moment. But as Angus said, it's not just about living alone. It's individual supported living. It's not about living alone. There's different mechanisms and different ways that can manifest. The key thing from our analysis is that the support is about having appropriate support. This can be paid and unpaid, and usually it is a mix of both, and the unpaid informal support plays a really important role in maintaining these arrangements. And there's a wide range of support hours. So I'll just show, this is for the subsample, and we looked at the number of hours of support, paid and unpaid. So you can see for one person who's living alone for 3 years, they have support for 356 hours a week. Somebody else who's in a relationship situation in the home for 3 years has 7 hours. So very broad range of hours of support, but all of these are ISL arrangements and all meeting criteria of what ISL is. And what was interesting is that there's no clear association between the number of hours of support and the outcomes from the ISL arrangement. But what does seem to be important is the appropriateness and consistency of those supports. So it's not about the amount, it's about the appropriateness and consistency, and that it is individualized and personalized to that person themselves. So in looking at some of these arrangements, there was common characteristics of what made a strong ISL arrangement. Typically, it happened over time. It was a gradual process. It was person-centered, and really was the arrangement and the living was built around that individual. So as Angus said, it's not about 20 people all on the one road. This is one person at a time. It isn't an easy process. People spoke about how difficult it can be. There's a lot of advocacy, a lot of fighting, a lot of bureaucracy that has to be overcome. And it usually involves a substantial amount of research, linking in with multiple stakeholders to support the person, having that circle of support around them, and looking at having good governance as well. So how is this going to be managed over time? Some of the arrangements that weren't so strong were characterized by reservations. So some people involved in the circle of support maybe weren't too clear about whether this was possible. Was it really realistic for this individual? Or it could be linked to adverse events like losing funding. So they were classified as a mid-range arrangement. And then others that were developing tended to be very crisis-driven. They didn't involve planning and they weren't really person-centered at all. One of the least developed areas in the arrangements was the informal supports. And there's a huge reliance on family, typically mothers. But if there's not enough funding for the formal supports, it puts the arrangement in jeopardy because the families come under a huge amount of pressure and it's no longer sustainable. So for example, one mother decided to place her adult child in a group home because there just wasn't enough funding for the formal supports and she couldn't continue the level of support that she was giving to her adult child. Social connections can also be a challenging area. We found that 2/3 of the arrangements reviewed were only mid-range for social connections and that more work is needed in that area in terms of ensuring the person has a wider social network, is engaging in the community and is participating, and it isn't just about presence within the community. Formal supports obviously are really important. They need to be flexible. There needs to be contingency planning. People's needs change over time. Situations change. The balance between paid and unpaid, formal, informal supports changes as well. So there's an element of setting up the ISL, but then being able to adapt and to build in those contingencies for the arrangement to be successful. And key to the success of the ISL is also the sustainability of funding. So people may have funding now. Is that going to be consistent? Will they keep the same level of funding? Will the funding match their changing support needs? Will it increase if they have heightened support needs? What we found was that 4 of the arrangements that were viewed as strong when it came to the funding that they had around the programme, 3 lived in social housing, which was capped at their disability support pension, and 1 of those persons lived in a home purchased by family. So having that stability of the home behind them and having that limitation in terms of cap of rent was really important to the sustainability. In speaking with people with disabilities and their support workers, and this is now drawing on the next phase of the research, where there was 21 people interviewed. And again, the sample was predominantly male. So out of the 21, there were 16 men that were involved in this interview. The tenancy arrangements were 10 were ownership, home ownership. There was 8 that were in private rental accommodation and 3 that were in public or social housing. And I think it's important that we understand the different ways that people are accessing housing, because as we know, the housing market is challenging, quite fraught, and very difficult to access private rental market for the majority of people in big cities. So I think to look at how people with disabilities are accessing that market and how sustainable that is over time is important. So 2 of the major pathways into the ISL arrangement was one from moving directly from the family home, and that was relatively a younger cohort of people that made that move. And the other group were moving from group home arrangements that maybe were inappropriate or an adverse event had occurred and the person had to move out quite rapidly. So in speaking to people, the WA had said that the previous arrangement was just not appropriate, that her son wasn't happy, he was getting ignored a bit, left sitting in a corner, and this was something that she wanted to see change, and that has changed by having the ISL arrangement. Another relative spoke about how her sister was taken out of the group home because they were rough with her, and sometimes she would have to have dinner at 4 p.m. and go to bed at 6 p.m. So a very regimented schedule, which is not typical to how we live our lives, and definitely doesn't facilitate choice and control in everyday activities. People spoke about the transition to ISL, again, that it needs to be gradual. And that was a consistent feedback we received from families and supporters and people with disabilities as well. So we have one mother speaking here. It was a gradual process so that she felt comfortable. So we furnished it and made sure that when she came, might come in the morning, or she might come for a little while, she might come back for a week, and then she started spending a little bit more time, not necessarily on her own or with me or whatever. And then when she decided it was the right time, she did her first night sleepover, and then it grew from there. So it was step by step so that the person could get used to it, but also that the supports could be tested and that the family could get used to that as well. People spoke about the benefits, again, having more choice, having safety, and a sense of belonging in the community. One parent spoke about the person-centeredness that was key to this arrangement, saying that her son, he gets to choose what he wants to do on a daily basis. So if he feels up to it, he'll, choose to go out. If he's not feeling great, he can stay at home, and that's okay. If he wants to watch a movie on TV, or if he wants to listen to music or watch his YouTube, his favorite activities, he can do that. And these are all things that we take for granted, but haven't always been available for people with intellectual disability and high support needs, that they can just choose not to do anything, or they can choose to watch the TV if they wish. And one sister speaking about her sister who had moved from a group home after being sexually abused there, focused on the main positive outcome for her sister was the sense of safety and security within her new environment. That we don't have to worry about being here, because those sort of things do come back to her and she'll just break out and cry. She's got safety. So she's got that one-to-one attention that she needs, because she needs a lot of support because she's deteriorating. So again, highlighting it, another part of inappropriateness and a very positive outcome upon moving. Future care planning is always a difficult subject for families and people with intellectual disability, and I think service providers as well. It's a difficult topic to engage with, and a lot of support needed on that. And ISL is no different. There is a fear around what will happen when I die. So parents wondering, will the whole arrangement fall apart? What do I need to put in place in terms of governance and management to ensure this continues? What will happen with funding? And also the unpredictability of housemates or other people that are living there. And there has been a number of circumstances where that tenancy agreement maybe didn't work out and needed to be exited in some way, or could end up in court. So there's lots of fear and anxiety around these arrangements, and that's why the gradual process, the planning, the research and governance is all really important to establish early on. So we have here the first housemate was generously remunerated to live with him and contribute to his life. However, after the death of someone close to him, this went downhill rapidly, and it was difficult to have the housemate removed from the living arrangement. So looking at contingencies and looking at planning. And I think speaking to families and people who are in these arrangements is so important, to learn from that experience and to build information, resources around those. The others relates to NDIS funding. So the first year of NDIS funding was really good and it worked really well, but the second year they really pulled the rug from under us. They cut the funding by 70%. So funding cut by 70%, how is the ISL arrangement going to continue? And I think this is an ongoing issue of the structure of NDIS, that the funding is great when people get it, but the annual process of review it creates a lot of anxiety around how sustainable it is going to be. Based on the interviews, the analysis of previous interviews and the literature review, we brought all of that information together into 4 thematic areas, and then we held workshops in WA and New South Wales. And from that, we have 4 fact sheets that are available. One focuses on getting the ISL model started. They act really as a summary of the key issues and key findings across all of the work that we did, but have been validated by parents and people with intellectual disability and people in the sector. So it's really emphasising that getting started, there's no one prototype. It is about the person. it's a gradual process, and that the ISL and ILO manuals that exist are good, useful tools for reference. The benefits are quite clear in terms of autonomy, health, choice, and independence. When it is the appropriate support and a strong arrangement, the benefits don't just happen. It has to be appropriate for that person. And the third fact sheet looks at coping with challenges along the way. So looking at it does take time to settle in. There is going to be staff turnover. There is going to be potential unsuitability or incompatibility with housemates. And there's also indications that people living in ISL may have difficulty accessing services when they're living in community settings, and that was raised in the workshops. And then managing change and planning for the future is the final fact sheet. So ensuring that you talk about the future, that you put those contingencies in place, that you look at the community of practice around that person, but also throughout all of this, that it's the person with intellectual disability that remains at the heart of planning. It is their ISL arrangement and their voice that needs to be prioritised. And I will hand over to Angus again to look at the policy.
Thank you. So I suppose when you think about what's been presented and probably a lot of your experiences, such approaches and practices, what we are putting on the table today, they cut across a whole range of levels. They cut across federal and state and territory governments and housing and disability services. I think Marianne sort of reflecting on that, I think you used the word battle, I'm not sure exactly what it was, but this is hard work sometimes because we're asking people to interact across multiple sectors and multiple challenges around that, and actually often pull things together to create what are often highly successful responses, but actually sometimes not successful because the bits don't always add up. And I think it's really important as part of moving forward. This is about understanding the complexity this actually sits in. This doesn't sit with one body, it sits with multiple bodies to create these highly individualized responses around people. I suppose when we're thinking about moving forward, it is recognizing that people with intellectual disability and high support needs have rights. We have the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. I think this is actually asking a more connected and holistic response around people more than a siloed response around simply NDIS, or it's about the state government's housing. It is requiring a connection of things together. I think it was flagged earlier and also through what we've come through, it does take time, it takes planning. I think there's some great example there of transition into the space, like over time. These are not always very quick solutions to build, but when it's done well, sometimes they're very, very successful. I think it is recognising, understanding the many barriers that are in place for, I think, everyone about housing, but actually especially people with intellectual disability to actually have their own housing. And I think the issue here is about when you start putting these arrangements in place, as Marianne was describing, what is the foundation for sustainability? And I think some of our current practices, as I think Marianne gave an example around Ndis Funding changing, doesn't provide the stability. And in many ways, that set doesn't provide the confidence for people to enter into these sorts of arrangements because it's not the stability that's there. I suppose that flexibility and responsiveness. So we're actually asking in the sense that, you know, if you're going to have this, people's lives and needs, like what's happening this year could be different next year. People have health, they have illness, families change. So there's a lot of complexity that sits behind this. And I suppose we're actually flagging this is when you see these successful options developed, people have navigated sometimes incredibly complex spaces to pull this together. From a policy development, I think we are probably three very broad, interrelated but distinct areas. I think Marianne flagged in her part of the presentation. We were, I think, I'm not sure if you were surprised or not, but the amount of actually documented evidence isn't particularly strong. And I think part of building this is building the base of evidence. And that is from experience, it is from success, it is from failure, it is actually from all the levels I spoke about, is understanding the experience across all levels. But the other piece of this is really important, and I think, you know, why we put quotes up today, it's also hearing voice. It's actually understanding truly from the experience of people with disabilities and their families and what it actually means and the difference it actually makes. And I think it's how we actually share and disseminate this information so people start to understand further what this is actually about and what it's actually trying to do. I think the second part is trying to find ways through this complexity about how do we establish enhanced opportunities for people with intellectual disabilities and high support needs to plan and establish their own ISL arrangement. So it actually becomes part of the narrative. It becomes part of the way we do business. It's actually an option on the table and a possibility for people. And often not, maybe some examples like Marianne described, where it was through crisis that happened, but also some of those options would have been with families who had been planning maybe since their kid was 13 and thinking about what it actually meant, and their kid's 25 now. And I've worked with families where they've taken that level of time and thinking and connection and navigating the complexities for that to happen. But actually, how do we help people do that rather than sort of becoming something families have to have the wherefore and skills themselves to do? And I think the other issue is once arrangements are in place, and I think it speaks to the sustainability piece, it's establishing and having mechanisms to actually safeguard this so arrangements are maintained. People have confidence and stability in their living arrangements and in their communities, and are not necessarily living in a concept of fear that next year I may not have the supports I actually need. So that's a very, I'm going to say it's a very brief walkthrough of our research, and hopefully you're getting the sense of where this is actually up to. By no means this is actually complete, in the sense there is a lot more to do. I think it's presenting a picture of, I think, incredible possibility for people, and people are living these opportunities now. But I think the policy position for us across all our sectors is how do we continue to, or think about bringing this together where it becomes a possibility for people, it becomes a way which we can work with people and people can see it actually as a future option for their living in community.
Thank you very much, Angus and Marianne, for that presentation. There's a wealth of information there, just tons to go through. I'll hand over to Alicia to give a sector response in just a moment. But before I do, I would like to encourage anyone watching and listening to submit questions through the Q&A section. We have a number of comments and questions already, but please get in there with your questions so that we can hopefully get to as many of them as possible. And I did want to address one question that came through about the fact sheets and are they available? And yes, we'll make sure that they're available on the AHURI website in the same space as the webinar recording in the next few days. So they will certainly be available. Alicia, please.
Thank you. And thanks for the presentation too. I think it's fantastic that we're having this conversation about individualised options for people with disability and taking it into that practical space. So I've got 5 minutes to whip through some reflections with you. So I thought I would touch on 3 things from the practical perspective of the work we do in the Housing Hub, which is very much working with housing seekers and providers of housing, but also the people that support people with disability to identify housing options. So one was just a quick overview of some of the housing options that are available and that we see for people with intellectual disability. I thought I would respond to some of the policy considerations we just heard about and what's happening in the market as well. And then I thought I'd end with just a few tips for you if you're someone there who is thinking about how to implement this, just some tips from us. So first of all, around the housing options for people with intellectual disability. So yeah, it is discussed throughout the report that, really only NDIS only supports housing for a small number of people. And in particular, SDA or specialist disability accommodation was noted there. And so, yeah, just noting that SDA is available, but it's only for about 6% of people on the NDIS, or 30,000 people. That's very low, and only 17,000 of the 30,000 people currently have that funding in their NDIS plan. So there's a lot of people who are eligible that don't know about it yet, which is a key issue that we can work on in the sector. And really concerningly, 13,000 of the 17,000 are actually using the funding. So there's about 4,000 people who aren't even using the SDA funding when they've got it. So again, could be lack of available housing, but also lack of awareness of options or being in some of the older models that have been mentioned. So the 2 different types of SDA would be improved livability and robust for the cohort that we're talking about here. So improved livability housing has some design features that people might need, as well as making sure that people with their very high support needs, and we saw some really high numbers just presented as well. So some people there would be actually eligible for SDA funding based on those support needs. But it's worth noting that improved livability housing is probably the housing that's developed the least and is the most in demand at the moment. And that's because the financial incentives are the lowest for this category, given that the built design isn't adjusted as much as it is for people with a physical disability. But what I really wanted to touch on, because that's SDA and that's only for a small number of people, but in the NDIS, there's the concept of individualized living options, or ILOs, and that was just touched on in the presentation as well. And I feel like this is the most relevant piece to the report that we've just heard about. And so some of the way that works is very similar to what's been identified here in the case studies. So it includes things like establishing the housing design and support design piece for the person with disability and then implementing that. And it's the same sort of language: co-residency models, host arrangements, and living alone and living with other people. And so there's two phases if people are looking to set up an ILO arrangement or explore that. And that can be funded by the NDIA for people who can show a reasonable and necessary need for this. And so those two steps are exploration and design, which is individually funded. Once you do that and work out what you need to put it in place, you can then be funded for the supports into the plan. And the other housing options that exist are predominantly the forms that are identified in the research. So lots of people are living in private homes, social housing and supported housing. So congregate care and group homes are really predominant for this cohort. Just a couple of pieces of data I pulled out from the Housing Hub for us yesterday around this to demonstrate. There's 2,181 published listings on the Housing Hub right now for accessible accommodation across the country. Of that, 65% are for specialist disability accommodation. So most of the listings coming through now are in this new SDA market, but we know that's not for most people. So there's a gap there. We're needing more non-SDA properties to be accessible from an information perspective for people with disability. Of those SDA properties, 26% of those are listings for improved livability and robust, so the cohort we're talking about. So again, another layer of potentially being underserved when we know that people with intellectual disability are a large cohort within the NDIS. And also of those improved livability and robust listings, 66% of those are for houses and group homes. So again, still seeing that trend of people having new properties, these are new build SDA being developed to live in more of a group setting than people having that individualised options. Something else I just thought I'd mention is we do have reports on these things. So we've got Housing Seeker Snapshot that we actually report on every 6 months to look at the data being put into the Housing Hub website. So the latest version that came out in June showed us that people were identifying with us as their primary disability. The most was autism, intellectual, and then psychosocial disabilities. So we're seeing activity largely in that group looking for new housing. The predominant living situations was private homes, and 68% of people said that they're dissatisfied or very dissatisfied with their current housing. So that's really concerning. And I feel like this data seems quite consistent with the report as well. In terms of the policy considerations presented, just on a practical note around some of those, I think it's worth noting around specialist disability accommodation that there are some real challenges in accessing that funding at the moment, and it's worth noting that it's is for that really small cohort of people. That we are seeing quite significant delays from people who are looking for more individualised options there. And so, again, we have published a report around that called Delayed and Denied, which is actually tracking how long it's taking the agency to make funding decisions for SDA. And then, of course, support is part of that as well, as we've heard through the reports. Safeguards were mentioned in the report too. And something I would note that I think is really important is that SDA housing is regulated. The support under the Quality and Safeguards framework is regulated. However, there's an emerging trend now of a type of housing that's being developed by for-profit providers coming into the market and offering housing and support packaged up as one piece. So that support might be regulated, but the housing that people are in isn't. And the real challenge there is that people are kind of trapped as if they don't like their landlord, who is also their support provider, they've got a real problem, and it means that people don't have full choice and control. So that's something we're keeping an eye on from a policy perspective. And funding certainty has been mentioned. Just again, that's a really key point. And we've had some co-design we've done recently, and that's come out loud and clear through participants that people are living in fear that their support funding will be cut and that they're going to have to move out of their home because they don't have the support to live there, even though that's supposedly separate to housing, but they're very interrelated. And just to highlight too the point in the report around outcomes measurement being critical, and we really want to make sure we're seeing the outcomes of people living in these new models within the market being measured and reported so that there can be continual quality of housing options for people, and we avoid some of these unintended consequences that emerge in the new market that's being established. And then finally, a couple of tips. I think what's really critical in navigating the NDIA system and coming up with these sorts of individualised options, you really need a great support coordinator, and you need a support coordinator who knows how to do this and has done it before. And there is a real gap in the market around that. So, we are, working on that as part of the Housing Hub to build the capacity of support coordinators and to offer some of those services as well where needed, especially people at risk of entering aged care or having to live in hospital. But there are some resources on our website if anyone is interested. I'm happy to put my email in the chat if anyone wants anything, but we do have a whole page on individualised living options that we've established, including a video series. And there's a story there about Ned, who's a young man with an intellectual disability who has created one of these situations that's really consistent with the report we're hearing about. So if there's anything like that of interest, I'm really happy to help anyone with any questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alicia. So we're now into the Q&A section of the webinar. We've got quite a lot of questions coming through already of a variety of types, but please don't hesitate to add to the discussion there, and we'll get to as many as we can. Angus and Marianne, we might actually just start with a couple of questions that are, I guess, clarifications on data and so on before we get into the broader ranging conversation. Firstly, do we have data on the length of time that people with disability live with their parents? How long they stay living with their parents, and any conclusions we can draw from that?
You want to go?
Yeah. In terms of the number of years that people tend to stay living with parents.
Yeah. I guess age. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure in terms of this particular sample, what the age, it tends to be a younger age cohort in 20s and 30s that people moved into the ISL when they moved directly from the family home. I suppose for people with intellectual disability, they tend to live with family for much longer. The typical transitions that we would make aren't necessarily available. So a very large proportion of people with intellectual disability continue to live with family, and family provide a lot of informal support and care without a lot of resourcing for that as well. But I think within our sample, people were in their 20s and 30s when they moved from the family home into ISL.
Anecdotally, I don't have hard data on it, but anecdotally, and working through my networks, there are a lot of parents who are supporting their adult children at home, obviously looking at other supports around them. I think a lot of it is they are looking for, and I think that issue you raised, Marianne, it's that really hard question still, what happens when I die? It's really that blunt, but and are living with that space. I think I see a lot of parents, if they've got means, setting up trust funds, setting up other arrangements, trying to establish the life they want for their son and daughter into the future. So, and many looking at current options going, that's not what I want. So I've been working with a family group, for example, working through looking at different community-based models because they're trying to find alternatives which are different from what actually exists, which probably draw upon some of the ISL sort of things. So it's interesting. I think it's a very broad scope of what's going on. I think there are families who just can't manage anymore and have to take alternatives which sometimes they don't want, or in fact they do want. And I think it's quite a broad range. I know that anecdotally from my networks and my conversations I have, but yeah, it's quite a diverse space.
And I guess picking up on that family support dimension, Mary, and some of the data you put up mentioned person living alone with 356 hours of support versus someone in a relationship receiving 7 hours of support. I think that was per week, was it?
That was per week, and it was a combination of unpaid and paid support. So I think what it's highlighting is that ISL can work for people. All of the people had high support needs and intellectual disability, but how that manifests in every day is very different. So the nature and level of support is very different, and therefore the type of support or the number of hours is different. So it's not to say that the balance of that was not being met or was being met by family. That was capturing the informal and the formal support as well.
The different needs. I think that the question that I was leading to here was asking, can we draw an inference that means that families often or relationships provide 350 hours worth of unpaid services? But of course, it's individual needs.
Yes, so we assume that person doesn't need necessarily the same amount as another person. But I suppose what we don't report on is an unmet need. So we have the paid and the unpaid, but there is some conversation needed around unmet need and the level of unmet need, because we don't want to assume that what the family are providing is the unmet need, and it's very different. So I think there's another category that we do need to come back to and look at what is that unmet need and who should be meeting it.
Yeah. Family support often too is around, it's a transition as well, like working some of the families I know here in Perth, that their involvement will drop off, or not drop off, that's the wrong term, their day-to-day connection drops off as they get more confidence about the arrangement, the people there who are supporting the trust and various things like that. So often you've had families who have been the sole support for many, many years. So especially with their children with vulnerabilities, it's quite a hard space for them to navigate around. So, and I've seen families who, probably more like the connections I have with my children now. I see them a couple of times a week, not every day, because the way it actually works. So I think it's very individualized, and I think some of those family supports represent many things. Not just direct support, but actually emotional support, actually family themselves, how they're navigating the space as well.
Yeah. And I think we found as well that people, even paid support, then there was a blurring of boundaries. Sometimes they became friends, and there was informal support then being provided by paid supporters. So I think it's not necessarily a very clear boundary all of the time, because these relationships are individualized and personal. Like, people build those relationships, and they do have a relationship sometimes outside of the formal context as well.
Thank you. There's one other, I guess, question of clarification from the presentation. Those background statistics, Angus, that you talked about, around 195,000 people living in shared care arrangements, but only around 14,500 between ages of 15 and 64. And perhaps if you could unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, so the big figure was it was quite encompassing, but it was very much, and we're talking about a group of very high support needs. So there's a much larger group who live in supported arrangements. This was very much focused on people with very high support needs. So I think the number looks quite small. I know it's probably much larger, but I suppose what we're trying to focus on here is a very particular group of people with quite heightened vulnerabilities, and who it's a very hard space to navigate because of the level of support which people are requiring due to some of those challenges. Yep.
Look, there are other definitional questions still coming through, so we might come back to some of those in a moment. But just to, I guess, expand the conversation out a bit, Alicia, you mentioned ILO arrangements, and there are some questions asking about the distinction between ISL and ILO. What's the difference broadly, and how do ILO options interact with the SDA opportunities? Can you use an SDA house for ILO and so on? Alicia, did you want to just unpack that a little for us?
Yeah, sure. So I guess from the individualised living arrangements are individualised, just like we've been hearing about with the report. So they will be different for each person, but they do have those same those 4 areas that we've heard about to the report. So I think it is quite similar, but I do think from reading the report as well, my view on that is it could also encompass people who are SDA eligible there. And I think that's where that second part of the question gets to about, well, what is the interaction between ILO and SDA? And it's really interesting because SDA is about the bricks and mortar, so it should be about the property, and ILO should be more about the support and the way you set up the property and the people in it to provide both formal and informal support. And so in theory, you should be able to have an ILO and an SDA together, absolutely. And I know of one so far that we've seen. It's something we're really keen to hear about at Housing Hub and do a case study on. But the Housing Hub team has supported one person in Sydney. So it's a person living in an apartment on their own as a person with a cognitive impairment, and they've got the Improved Livability SDA funding because they have very high support needs. So they've got SDA on that basis, not the functional impairment piece. And they're able to then model their own support package that meets their needs, which can give them that ILO nature instead of using SIP, supported independent living. So it is possible, but it has been hard. And I think one of the key challenges here again is navigating that and working out how to get both SDA funding and then the ILO funding. It's complex. So you need a really good support coordinator. You need really great allied health professionals working with you around your evidence, and just stick there and work through. So that's what I would say.
I think when you look at ILO and SDA together, I think if you marry them together, you'd have ISL. You'd have, because the ISL is the integration of the environment, the physical space, and the support. It's the support being key and appropriate, but it doesn't exist without there being a home, like a physical structure as well. So I think, Alicia, you're right. They put the two of them together then.
Yep. I think just what you described flags the complexity of, like, it's this and it's that, and it's having a team of experts around it about environmental adaptation, so on, and all possible, absolutely possible. But it's that sense of how you coordinate that. How does someone get that support to do that? Because that's not what an average family should have to do or manage. That's about actually how we bring that together to enable what Marianne just said, is the bringing the two together. But that's a complex process.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it just highlights again that if we are talking about people in the cohort with very high support needs, which is what we're talking about, that as people set their plan and their goal with the NDIA, being very clear about having a home and living goal that talks about what people want to do and how that's going to contribute to everyone's life, but then also making sure that we advocate for level 3 support coordination. So you can get someone with that expertise, maybe with an allied health background as well, who can actually take you through that complex journey. So that's really important.
Angus, I know it's quite early in Perth still, but to move to a philosophical question, why has it taken us so long to arrive at a supported independent living approach, given we started moving away from large congregate living models in the 70s with the advent of normalisation theories? Why is this such a slow journey?
I often reflect on that. Like, as you pointed out before, I've been here at Curtin as an academic now since 2008, but I spent 16 years as an occupational therapist and working as policy in Disability Services Commission here in Western Australia. And I headed up local area coordination, whose whole role was about connection and community and building options like this. And I think one of the challenges is that it is the investment required. It's about actually, I think one of the things we speak about is person-centeredness. It's about the time it takes to connect with people about truly what is important. And it's a saying I tend to work, and I say to my students, when systems become more important than people. So sometimes things end up being driven by the system. Here is a funding system which sort of drives what you actually get, versus actually, now here is a person-centered approach. Then how do we build a response around that using the funding? Now, that's probably a bit simplistic, but I think one of the challenges I'm hearing is that, I'm hearing people talk about NDIS almost as a system driving responses, not actually about truly individualized, worked up responses around what am I actually wanting in my life? I'm wanting to live in community. What does that truly actually mean? How do we start to build what that actually means as an individualized response? And then how does the systems truly respond? So theoretically, SDA and ILO should be doing that, but it's actually how we actually make that happen. So I think there is, and I think ultimately is what I flagged earlier too, Michael, I think there's issues around that people's lives are not in silos, and our systems our systems are quite siloed, and it's the ability to bring all of those together. And they are complex systems. Like, I find them complex enough as someone who's been immersed in this my whole career. But for a family who's dealing with disability and the day-to-day challenges and so on, to actually have to navigate this space is very difficult. I'll actually give an example. Like, I'm managing 3 aged care relatives in aged care, and it just blows my mind about how I have to speak to 3 government agencies to get 1 funding payment sorted out. That's my job later today. It's just extraordinary. And with my health literacy and so on, it is really hard work still. And I think we expect families often to step into that space. And I can see why people go, it is just easy to go to a certain pathway. So I don't think we make it easy. And I don't think that's anyone intentionally doing anything, but it's the way our systems have worked for a very long time, and it's how we connect that up, and why we actually are now funding level 3 support coordinators, because we need people that level of skill to transverse the whole structure and systems. So that's a very long-winded response, and I haven't had my coffee yet, but that will probably reflect, I think, where I've sat in this, and I've been sort of working in this space for 30 years, and I don't think it's got particularly better.
I think as well, it came up, I totally agree with Angus. I think it's the resourcing, it seems too hard, it takes longer. And one of the families spoke about, it comes to what can you do with the resources that are available rather than what can you do, what's possible. So you don't do that big thinking around the person sometimes, because it is very much, this is what we have, so we have to make this work. And that's the restrictions that families are placed under as well. And that the system places on people with disabilities in terms of what is possible, what do I actually really want in terms of how I live and where I live, but this is what's available.
There's a thread of comments. Sorry.
I was going to say something, if that's all right.
Please, no, please do.
I agree, it's about the funding, because I think it has been driven by that, because people can't see what's possible if we can't work out the way to fund it. That's what I hear a lot. And I think it made me think with that conversation, just to add something, is, a critical issue right now we need to work on as a sector is that a lot of people with intellectual disability are living in group homes and congregate care. And most of those people would have limited rights, like I mentioned, over housing versus like landlord versus support provider. So actually working out what do we do about all of the legacy stock and housing that exists, and how we create a model that, can be funded so people can have more independence and choice and achieve their goals, I think is a big challenge for us at the moment. As the next question there, which will come back to funding, I feel.
Well, in fact, that's the thread I'm going to pick up from the questions coming through. There are a number of questions, and the phrase "level the playing field" comes through in a number of them, both in terms of people's living arrangements, their ongoing living arrangements, whether they're with family or not, in terms of the transitions that Marianne talked about and those models. For all of that, the resources of the family seem to be a really important dimension here, and so those who are relatively privileged are better able to manage this.
Yes,
so how do we level that playing field? How do we improve the options for those who have less wealth in their family to get appropriately equitable solutions? Thoughts on that?
Yeah. I think it's less wealth, but also they might not have the time, they might not have the health themselves, that way to provide the support. So there's definitely a huge inequity in terms of who can access an arrangement like this and who can't. And I think too often there's way too many expectations on family carers in terms of what they do and what the system will step away from. I was speaking as someone with a brother with severe intellectual disability, and my father's the primary carer and got no support during COVID at all. No day services, no at-home support, no respite. It's just expected that carers will pick up whatever is needed to be done, but it's not always possible, particularly as people are getting older, carers are getting older. All of that will lead to more crisis placements, people being left in A&E. So yeah, I think there's a huge piece of work in terms of how do we make this an option for everybody. I think having advocacy and information separate to Service providers is one of the things that we looked at in the report as well, so that there was national advocacy funded, so that people could access that support. It wasn't tied into a provider who might be providing the housing. So they're not trying to sell you a service and advocate for you to go for that service. It's like a completely different support mechanism that's there. And maybe people who don't have those informal supports, because we know people with intellectual disability have smaller social networks. There is, lots of research on that, and particularly as people get older. And with aging parents as well, and parents dying, then there is more of a risk of people with intellectual disability ending up in institutions, which are completely inappropriate, or being at a huge risk of homelessness as well. I don't think I answered the question. I think I just kind of.
I think you agreed with the sentiment of it, which I think
I do agree with the sentiment, and something is needed. And I think national advocacy was one thing that could help. But yeah, there's a more
I suspect we're in
complex.
furious agreement on this issue.
Angus might have more to say on
Yeah.
that.
I suppose the thing is about this, I think it is, I'm coming back to being family-centred or person-centred sort of orientated practice. And I think this is where we have, I don't overgeneralise, but almost the one-size-fits-all model where, and it fits probably the average person, which we don't have, but on a lovely distribution curve, there are people who thrive in that space because of capacities, what you're describing, or people who we know will be incredibly disadvantaged by it. And I think that's the risk, I think, of our current arrangements. And I think where that disadvantage exists is that there is a need to ensure that those people are supported and connected. There have been historical models around, such as local area coordination, not what we mean by today, but the models where, in fact, there were people working in community with 50 or 60 families. And a lot of the time that was working with maybe only 10 of those families, because a lot were thriving and managing, who actually needed, additional support in a family-centred, person-centred model to actually help over time shape and guide and build things. And I think there's a space for, I think, that sort of support for people on their own terms when they actually want it. But I think the system doesn't always support that. And I think it's how people respond into those spaces and how we respond to people. I don't think there's always a risk that people fall between the cracks when we have an approach, and the individualisation, much we're talking about individual living supports, it's actually individualised supports to people to help them develop whatever. And I think that is, something which we really need to continue to have a dialogue and narrative about in this country, about what is the best way to support individuals and families who need that support. Some don't, and some need quite a lot to actually thrive and be part of community.
A couple of comments picking up on the inequality side of things and access. One of the points made here is of course that the group homes were cheaper. That's part of the reason for their But their use is for a government. They are a cheaper way to go about it, becoming effective. Many institutions is the phrase used. But following on from that, sorry, please.
Sorry, because one of the issues we have is that we don't have a huge amount of evidence of cost benefit across any home and living options. So we did a piece of work for the National Disability Insurance Agency the year before last, looking at alternatives to group home and congregate settings, and also did one in Ireland as well, where we did a systematic review, but there's very limited data on costs. So I think we had 3 papers that had cost data in it, and it wasn't possible to analyse them because there was such inconsistency in how the cost data was recorded. So I think definitely there are savings when you think about, okay, everybody's in a centre and we have all the support centralised, but we actually really need data on that. We really need to have more cost studies and look at the cost benefit of different housing models and look at them over time. We need longitudinal data on cost and longitudinal data on outcomes. So really we want to see that the outcomes then are more cost effective in the long term. We'd be only looking at one point in time and not capturing the long-term outcomes, and also there's huge costs in terms of transition, and they're never captured or reported. So what does it cost to transition from a group home into the community and all of that as well? So I think it's a really good point, but there's lots of work that we need to do in that. I think it's a real deficit across all housing options for people with disabilities, that cost piece.
Yeah.
Yep.
I was just going to jump in too and say, there's certainly, I agree, we need to do more work in this space, and it needs to be consistently done across all the different types of housing and support models. But there is some work that has happened that does show actually, I don't think it's been publicly released, but there was some work done last year that showed that people living in single occupancy SDA in a lot of cases were actually more cost effective when you took the whole housing and support package together over time than 3 people sharing. So that was really, really positive to see, because, the hypothesis is if you can live in these more individualized properties, and we heard that in the report, people's behaviours are changed because people have more control, over time support might change as well. And I think part of the outcomes framework point I was making before as well is that it needs to be part of this, what's the cost over time. And I know Summer Foundation has started that work and published a report that did show, for a small number over the first 12 months, reduce their support hours at a significant level that would mean over time moving into individual housing would actually save the scheme quite significant amounts of money. So we need to get more of that evidence to have this conversation, because there's a perception, it's so much cheaper for 3 people to live in a house together and share support than, say, 10 people live on their own and share support.
And Michael, I think also it's very easy to throw an economic lens on this only, but there is a moral lens, there's a human rights lens, and I think those all need to be as part of, we want to use cost-benefit analysis. I'm not sure it's quite the right term, but it's about human benefit analysis in some ways. It's about how does this benefit someone to live a life that you and I would like to live. I always remember I used to send students out. They used to go and spend time in group homes. This was my second year students. And by week 6, we always had this cathartic moment where a couple of students used to go, well, it's okay for them. And I'm going, so would you be happy to live in that space? And then we had this amazing, usually had tears and unhappiness, and we worked our way through it where people realised the humanness of this. And I think what I always come back to is this notion of humanity about people and just living good lives. And we know, would I want to live in these sorts of these spaces? And the answer is absolutely not. So why is it okay for someone else? I think that's a societal question which we all need to take on board, which I know probably we haven't got time to open up today. It's probably another whole webinar, but I think it's an important one because it underpins actually how we treat and manage people in our communities, in our society. And I think it's actually very much fundamentally about, if you apply an economic lens, you get to a certain point. If you apply a human rights lens, you get somewhere else.
Yeah, great point.
Agree with everything you just said, Angus, but in the interest of time, we'll move us on.
Yes, that's fine.
I guess following on from that discussion, though, there's some questions, I guess, around the role of public housing, and we might expand that to social housing, so bringing in the community housing sector as well. What is the role of social housing in provision of or support of independent supported living arrangements? Is it just being a housing provider, or do they do more?
Well, I think it probably goes to that piece I'll speak about. I think they're part of the system. They're part of the great jigsaw put together. I think, there's some fabulous social housing. I think often people conjure up some pretty horrible images of it, but some really great options being provided for people with disabilities. But it's part of the whole picture. It's about what other supports around it, where it sits in community, all of those things. So I think it's part of the complexity, and it's a very important part state governments, provide into the picture. I don't know if they've got a role I don't think their role is to provide, there's other levels of support. They do something really, really well, but it's connection into the other bits like Alicia was talking about, and, the planning and the supports and the other funding and around the supports that sit in that space. But their role is to ensure that their housing stock locations, it's in great places for people, where we're not actually creating what I describe as disability ghettos, where we put everyone in the same place. It's actually in good community locations. It's actually accessible places to community facilities. It's so we're not actually isolating people further. It's actually enabling people. So there is a point where it's got to be part of the solution, but it's part of that solution.
Yeah, totally. I think the challenge with social housing is there's just not enough.
Yes.
Like there's a really depleted social housing stock in Australia. So that needs to be addressed. We need to have more social housing built, And we need to ensure that there's universal design incorporated within any new builds that are coming, so that we don't have to then go back and make modifications that should have actually been built into the original design. And that will really help.
It's remarkable. Almost any topic on housing does tend to land on that point somewhere along the way. Elisa, did you want to add to that as well?
No, I think that the points have been made. Yeah.
Okay. There's a question here around, well, there are a number of specific questions that we may or may not get time to get to, but there's one here about, well, what about people with high support needs over 65? Once people turn 65, do they just default to the aged care system, or what is the interplay there? And is it a transition there? Who would like to?
Well, that's a big question.
It is a thorny question, undoubtedly.
Yeah, it's a system and a policy issue and a funding issue, is that disability and aged care continue to operate separately. And that's in Australia, and it's in other countries as well. And it's how do we have that conversation? And for people with intellectual disability, aging starts at a much earlier age. We're looking at people aging from their 30s and 40s. So we're talking about, aging and the impact of aging and where people live and the kind of supports they need. We can't wait until 65. People with Down syndrome who have dementia in their 30s and will need a specific kind of setting and care in order to live in the house that we're choosing. So I think we need to, I think the system needs to move away from this age marker, and it needs to look at the individual and the needs that the person has. And I think in a very simplistic way, aged care and disability need to work together in terms of funding and supports, and not try to, we have to look at the intersectionality here of people, and how all of their needs as a whole human being needs to be met. But
well, I think it's actually, it's having a lifespan model that people live a life, and we need to support that. And I think this sort of artificiality of 65 is, quite amazing. I suppose it's set in a place like, theoretically, I might retire at 65, but my health hopefully will still be okay. You're not accessing systems. We've got people who are accessing systems much earlier. And therefore, this piece of bit you're in and what you're accessing, and it's the same when people are trying to access health and so on. So it's not unique to just this. It's a very complex space where people are pulled from pillar to post, often trying to manage that. I think, around disability, it is around lifespan. It's around, how do you enable continuity? And quite honestly, when we're talking about living, when I hit 65, my life doesn't change. It goes on. It just is that I'm a bit older and I might need some additional supports. And I think it's how we respond to that. It's how systems respond to people without people's lives being disrupted. And that's the challenge we have, where people then have to navigate whole new spaces and do things differently, versus really it may well be funded from somewhere differently, but why does it have to change? Which would be that's that continuity of lifespan, which is the essential part for people.
Marianne, I might come back to in fact, we're going to come back to the same point in the data that we talked about a little bit earlier, that 356 hours in a week of support that has triggered a bit of curiosity, pointing out that there's only 168 hours in a week. So is this representing two people around the clock providing support?
Yeah, it's the combination of the informal and the formal support. So they will have multiple people providing support. So I should have clarified that.
No. I think it's worth it's worth airing, but because it does speak to quite different needs to someone who's getting 7 hours a week. Exactly,
and some carers might feel like there's 356 hours in the week, given the stress they can be under and demands on their time. But it's the double.
Sorry, Angus, you were going to add something there, I think.
No, I must admit, I questioned that figure when the report came out too. The same issue, because I think, but it does typify. Often we think caring is a single person, but it's multiple. Often it's multiple variations, and so it does take quite a lot of contribution often for that to happen.
There's a comment here that I think is worth exploring. The presentation really sort of was framed around a from and to approach, moving from one tenure to another. So what role might a more transitional or temporary accessible housing play in helping people achieve good outcomes of a home? Marianne, did you want to speak to that one?
Yeah, I suppose there is, work done in that space where it's almost like an in-place training in place in terms of building up in living skills and using that as a model. I suppose it's about ensuring that there is a longer term housing in place. It's not people are being, in this transitional space for too long, or that it isn't actually leading somewhere and part of an overall process. But there's definitely models of training that would use intermediate housing so that you can build up that and be part of that gradual process of moving towards more independent living. I'm not sure if Alicia has examples in terms of what you do, but
yeah, sure, Marianne. I was just going to mention again, I know I'm often referring to the funding. So you've got the view with me with the funding and then Angus with the other view, of course. But in terms of the funding and how that works under the NDIA, there is funding available for medium-term accommodation. And yeah, we've definitely seen some people we've worked with complex needs who are transitioning from maybe a more congregate care or even aged care, for example, where you aren't able to build your skills and do much for yourself. Being able to go into medium-term accommodation really helps people do that transition. But also, I think I agree that even it's built into that system, the point Marianne's just made about you need to have your long-term housing option because we don't want to see people trapped in that system long-term. And I think that's actually one of the conditions of that funding now. That's something people can access.
There's I guess an example of this come through in one of the comments received that someone speaking from experience that families aren't supported enough in sustaining informal care as their child becomes an adult, and an example where a family was looking after a child as they became an adult with very little breaks and needing to go to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal to get a 19-year-old to be able to do 6 sleepovers a year to be somewhere else, away from them and get used to being away from them. That sounds like a pretty difficult, a lack of transition in that approach. So.
Yeah, it's really tough. I mean, I've seen some comments in there too around support and support being denied or housing funding. And I think what you just picked up on there, Michael, is a real current issue around, thousands of people are appealing now, not just the internal reviews, which is now publishing some data on, but going to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. And I know the Housing Hub team's supporting 120 people right now to take their appeals forward that way for things that they're eligible for under the Act. It's very clear they've got the evidence. So we really hope that we're going to see a shift in that kind of soft policy that's evolved around discouraging people from living alone or, saying what their preferences are. Yeah.
Probably a question more for Angus and Marianne. There's a question here about, well, what sort of evidence of success should people be collecting to support an evidence base on and to improve policy? How can households or providers, gather further evidence to support this work?
In terms of tracking outcomes, is it?
That's right. Well, that's right. In terms of, in demonstrating success of different approaches. Yeah.
I think you'd be looking at the characteristics of the ISL model. So you're looking at that issue of choice, control, autonomy, social inclusion, looking at ways to track that over time, building it into data collection that already happens so that it becomes part of the administrative data sets that we have, acknowledging that ISL is a particular model of housing and looking at outcomes associated with that. I think that, it's overall quality of life, but breaking it down into particular indicators and I think it's longitudinally we need to look at that. But if you can have it as routine data collection, then that's fantastic because it's there. It's more cost effective for the sector overall. Yeah.
And part of it, I think, is building the evidence base around, I know it's individual, we want the collective, but it is actually also asking people what is good, what makes you happy, like why is this working? And I think starting to build that full picture up, which may end up sort of informing that, but we can have the overall collective, but ultimately, once again, I think picking up on the theme, this is quite individual. What, for some people would be good may not be for others. And that's a really important piece of how we actually capture outcomes as well.
There's a really interesting comment here, picking up on some of the language you used there, I think, Marianne, around choice and control. And we talk about choice and control as part of the design of NDIA, but how do we reconcile choice and control when we have a very constrained housing market everyone, let alone for those with particular needs. And a market that is driven ultimately by profit. So how do we reconcile those constraints, particularly for our most vulnerable?
I think it comes back to the human rights piece, that housing is a human right, not an investment property, so I think it's really about moving that conversation and maybe looking at legislation for housing as a human right, which has happened in some European countries. So, it's built into the expectations of the society that everyone has a right to housing that is appropriate.
Choice and control also sits in realism. It's not, I would love to live on adult multi-story house overlooking Cottesloe Beach. It's never going to happen. So, but I think it is, we operate in realistic spaces, and I think that's part of this as well. So I think when often it's put on the table, people think it's just often quite naively unfettered world, but it's not. And we are often living in, capacities that currently exist. The choices, we may have 2 choices instead of 10. It may be this is what you can afford compared to that, but it sits in that space as well. It's not, it's not nirvana. We know that. And every now and then the choices grow, the choices diminish. It is, people with disabilities are also living in community, and this is our community at the moment. It's challenging and it's harder when you're in that vulnerable space, but it's how you navigate some of that as well.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Angus, and to take into account the cost of disability as well. So we're not all starting from the same level playing field.
No.
There are extra costs that people with disability have, extra challenges. So choice is restricted, but we have to acknowledge the extra disadvantage that is there and make sure that we address that as a society.
Yeah, I'd just add to that, I agree with what you said, and just that the information piece, so people actually having access to information is critical. And when we think about people and where they're living and who they're in contact with, it's actually quite hard sometimes to make sure that people do have access to all that information to exercise that choice as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. Let's see, Alicia, I might bring this next question to you. So asking if there are good examples of co-located separate housing and supports combined with some sort of communal facilities. So it's sort of a modern co-housing model. Are there good examples of that you've seen or that you can point to that people can look at that can be done without sort of being prohibitively expensive?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's happening with SDA, it is a market response, and I think it goes to the point that's just been made about profit as well, but it is creating some more of these models that are more innovative. So I would say that, we call it X+1, which is effectively people getting to live on their own or in, like with a housemate that they choose. So having that choice over where to live and who to live with, and then having choice over supports that come in, it is actually cost effective, as I mentioned before, with that data that we've seen, but people have full choice over who their supports are now. And the cost effective piece also comes in by 10 or 15 people having access to on-site shared support. So I think that model is really innovative. And I think the real challenge to us, and we're trying to explore this now in a practical way in the market, is how do we create some more options like that aren't sitting within SDA, so that there are, places where people can share support. It doesn't have to be a traditional group home where you're locked in to all your support with one provider. So if anyone's, interested in that space, that is something that we are exploring in the market at the moment and looking at how we could create a demonstration of that.
Terrific, thank you. Well, that's possibly a more optimistic note to finish on than some of the quite tricky questions we've been dealing with. So we have now unfortunately reached the end of our webinar, and I'd really very much like to thank Angus, Marianne and Alicia for speaking today. It's been a really rich conversation, and I want to thank everybody who's participated through the Q&A. There's just a wealth of questions. I apologise for those we didn't get to. There were many we didn't get to, but we've tried to get as much of a cross-section as we could of the questions coming through. We do look forward to bringing you more webinars throughout 2022, and if you want to ensure that you get the invitations in your email, make sure that you subscribe to the Ahuri News through our website. So a quick reminder that we would appreciate your feedback by completing the short survey that will be sent to you today. And if you want to share this webinar with your colleagues or others, it'll be on our website shortly to do so. So until we see you again in person, thank you all for joining us today.